Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to session 4 of Born in the Wild or Born in the Wilderness. As you see there, the wilderness is not your ending, it is your beginning. This is actually early Thursday morning, so I'm a little late in getting this out there to YouTube land, but I didn't want to go another full week without posting. Sometimes in this journey, you have to listen to what your body says. And my body just wasn't allowing me to get up and record the video. So I listened to it and I rested. And sometimes you have to do that in your wilderness seasons. You don't have to overly exert yourself when your body is begging for the rest. It is important during our seasons, regardless of what they may be, that we listen to what our body is telling us. So let's get started. Last week, we were at the Red Sea and we talked about how the children of Israel, they saw impossibilities on every single side. And what we saw was we watched how God opened water that had never been opened before, and Israel walked through on dry ground. And the enemy behind them, Pharaoh's army, was swallowed up. And then I don't think I mentioned it much in last week's episode, but I think about after that event, they sang a song of Moses, it's called, and it's one of the most beautiful songs I thought, a good worship song. There are a few songs in scripture that you could read, and they said, Yah is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. So we're going to go to what is believed to be 3 days later, and we're going to talk about the bitter war at Marah. And so I want you to think about the timing of all of this. Just 3 days before, they witnessed a miracle. The sea opened. So at that time, I'm sure it was one of the greatest miracles of their generation. And it was just 3 days before since they sang that song, that God is their strength. And so they had been walking through the wilderness. I'm just trying to set the stage here. They had been walking through the wilderness, no water. They were thirsty, exhausted. That miracle from 3 days ago is wearing off. And think about it in the desert, they're in heat, intense heat, probably. And then I'm sure there was one person that said, oh, look, there's water, finally. And then they probably run to that water to be able to drink, only to find that they cannot do so because the water is bitter. And they named that place after what that water tastes like. And, the thing that I find interesting in this passage of scripture is that we don't read that God led them away from the water, because remember, it was God who was leading them. No, it says he led them to it. So the bitter water was actually on the itinerary. It was something that they had to face. It was, maybe I'm going to say it was their second test. And the name that God reveals of himself there, the name he chose us to speak at that moment when they're at the bitter water, was Rapha, Yahweh, or some of you say Jehovah, Yahweh Rapha, the Lord who heals. And so think about when he didn't expose himself as Rapha at the Red Sea. Nope, he revealed himself as Rapha, the one who heals, when they were at the bitter water. Sometimes when you think about the names of God, some names you can only learn at that bitter place. So let's go ahead and get into the word. We're going to be at Exodus 15, verses 22 to 26. And I'm actually going to do something different. I'm going to actually read Exodus 15, verse 22 and 26. Normally, I just go in and start talking because the expectation is that I want you to go to the word and read and confirm that what I am saying is so. I'm very big on that. But this time I'm feeling led to read Exodus 15, verses 22 through 26. So I'm reading from the Free of Life version that I have in front of me. Then Moses led Israel onward from the Sea of Reeds. They went out into the wilderness of Shur, but they traveled 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink from the waters because they were bitter. On account of this, it was called Marah. So the people complained to Moses, saying, "What are we going to drink?" So he cried out to Yah, and Yah showed him a tree. When he threw it into the waters, they were made sweet. There he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them. He said, "If you diligently listen to the voice of Yahweh, your God, do what is right in his eyes, pay attention to his mitzvot or his commands, his statutes, and keep all his decrees, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I am Yahweh who heals you." That's why he revealed himself as Yahweh, because he said all of the diseases, everything that he put on Egypt, it will not come on them if they pay attention to his commands and keep all of his decrees. If you diligently listen to the voice of God, then he will put none of the diseases that was placed on Egypt, he will not put it on them. And that is a powerful statement that we tend to look over sometimes. But he revealed his name at that bitter place. I want you to hold on to that. And so now we're talking about wandering with purpose. And we just read Exodus 15, 22 through 26. And I want to focus on that it was 3 days. 3 days. And I keep coming back to that number because I think the timing was intentional. It wasn't 3 months after the Red Sea. It wasn't even 3 years. It was 3 days. And the miracle that they just experienced at the Red Sea was still fresh. The song was still on their lips, so to speak. And God leads them straight into the wilderness of Shur with no water for 3 days. And then he brings them to water, but yet they cannot drink it. And what I did was, and I don't have the notes in front of me, but what I did the other day, I looked up how long can you go without water? And it gave anywhere from 3 to 5 days. The shorter end was um, if you happen to have other water resources like in your food and your fruit, you tend to be on a 3-day time frame. But they said that if you were already hydrated and then you had some food um, that was, had a high water content, then you were going to last the 5 days possibly. So it went from 3 days, like if you were already dehydrated, you weren't eating any foods or fruit with any water content, then you were at the 3 days. And I thought that was significant for me to look up because just think about And even when I looked that up, it did say a consideration was also whether or not you were sweating, what the temperature was out there, what you were doing. So I want you to kind of picture what we're seeing here. What we're seeing here is people traveling 3 days into a wilderness, the dry desert, hot. They're thirsty, and then they come up to some water that they're not able to drink. And what did the people do? Remember, they had just witnessed the plagues in Egypt. They were delivered. They just experienced the miracle at the Red Sea. They had just given glory to God by singing that song. And then instead of turning to God, they grumbled against Moses. But watch what happens here. Moses cries out to Yah, and Yah shows him a piece of wood, a tree. And Moses throws it into the water, and the water becomes sweet. No one would have guessed that a tree thrown into bitter water would heal that water. And then God speaks, and the name he chooses to reveal at this moment is the name that could only be given here in this moment. I am Yahweh Rapha, the Lord who heals. It was at the place where they were disappointed and they were thirsty. And that is when he reveals himself as the Lord who heals. So the bitter water was a classroom for that name that he revealed right there. And you cannot receive this particular revelation of who he is unless you're at that bitter place. So I don't want you to miss it here. Remember, this is a series of born in the wild, born in the wilderness, because some people die in the wilderness. We have some that are born in the wilderness. So I'm hoping that you get these little nuggets that I'm pulling out of the wilderness wanderings of the children of Israel. So there was purpose in leading them to the bitter waters, and it was there that God revealed himself as a healer, but he yet continues with his covenant and says, if you obey my voice and if you do my commands and honor my statutes, then everything that you've seen happen, that you saw that happen to Israel, will not happen to you. And so now let's go over to the I. What's the inventory that we see during this time? This is the inventory question that I want to ask you. What is your Marah? I want you to specifically think about what in your life right now looks like it should be refreshing, but it is not. So, what looked like an answer to prayer and it turned out to be bitter? Did you run towards something like the children of Israel did? Did you run towards something expecting water? And when you got there, you found you could not drink it. I want you to name that thing, whatever just came to mind. I want you to go ahead and name that place. You may have prayed. You thought that there was going to be an answer. You thought there was going to be a level of relief, but then you get there only to find disappointment. Name that thing. And here's a second. Remember, we're taking inventory. We're taking inventory while we're in the wilderness. And there is a second question I'm thinking of here. How long have you been standing in that bitter place? How long have you been standing in that disappointment? Israel stood there for 3 days before they got to Marah, before they got to the water. But some of you have been standing at your bitter water for 3 years, even, maybe even longer. Or maybe you've been there for 30 years. But there's something that happens when you stay at the bitter water too long without bringing it to God. You start to taste everything through that bitterness. What am I saying? You begin to see everything through that lens of disappointment, that lens of bitterness. And you have to realize that bitterness is not just a feeling, it's a filter. It's a filter. And when you have been hurt or disappointed deeply enough and long enough, bitterness becomes the lens through which you interpret every new thing, every relationship that comes across your path, every opportunity, because you're bitter and disappointment. Every new word from God, you see through the lens of bitterness. So you taste it before you can even drink it, and then you decide that's going to be bitter too. That is what you are carrying into the wilderness if you have been at Marah too long. If you have been in that place of bitterness too long, that is what you're carrying into the wilderness season. And that is the inventory that I want you to put down today. That bitterness that you have been holding towards God. Or maybe you're holding it towards the person who disappointed you or towards the season that did not go the way that you expected it. Or you have bitterness for yourself. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes we make choices that led us to the very place that we're in. And so now you're walking in a place of condemnation because you can't get over the fact that you made some choices that led you into the predicament that you are here, that you are in right now. And I'm asking you, if this is the inventory you found that you have carried into the wilderness, I am asking you to put it down at the feet of Yahweh Rapha, because that inner man, that heart that is bitter, that soul that needs healing, is the exact thing that he heals. So if your inventory includes disappointment, bitterness, you've had it so long that it has now changed your perspective, I want you to lay that at the feet of Yahweh Rapha. So now we're going to learn the landscape. What is God teaching at this place of bitterness at Marah? I want you to look at three things. First, God does not always remove the bitter thing. Sometimes he just has to transform it. See, Israel did not get rerouted around the bitter waters. No, God did not open a fresh spring nearby. What he did was he led them straight to the bitter water, and then he threw a tree into it. That was his method. He transformed the bitterness. So I want you to think about that because it has implication for that bitter thing in your life that you have been asking God to take away. And maybe he is not going to take it away. Maybe he is going to throw something into it. Maybe the healing looks like transformation from the inside, but not removal from the outside. That is the landscape that you are supposed to learn. The second thing is the tree is never what you expect. It was a piece of wood. That is what healed the water. It wasn't a prayer formula. It wasn't some special ceremony. Nope. God showed Moses a specific tree and Moses threw that tree in the water and the water was made sweet. So we have to recognize that sometimes God's healing methods are rarely what we imagine them to be. We put God in a box, but God sometimes uses the ordinary thing where we're looking for something extravagant. Sometimes he uses the very unexpected thing, the thing that does not look powerful enough to do what needs to be done. And I want you to pay attention to what he is showing you here. The tree you are walking past might be the very thing he intends to throw into your bitter place. And there's something prophetic that I want you to hear there. That tree represents the very thing that our Messiah died on, and he brings healing through his finished work on the cross. And the third thing I want you to get from here is he could only reveal his name at that bitter place. Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals. This name was not available to Israel before that. He didn't reveal himself as the healer before that, because maybe they didn't quite need it in the way that God wanted them to experience it at that time. They had not necessarily experienced the bitter place deeply enough to need a healer. And I know you may be saying, well, Monica, they were in slavery for generations. What do you mean they didn't experience bitterness? What do you mean that they didn't have the wrong perspective? Think about it. Because even in slavery, they were cared for. Because remember, one of the things they kept doing, and we're going to go to that, they kept saying, oh, Moses, you brought us in the wilderness to die. We should have just stayed in stayed in Egypt. At least we had the cucumbers and the leeks and all, and they thought about that. So they were nourished. But here, they did not fully experience God until they were wandering for 3 days and they were thirsty and they saw some water, but they couldn't drink it. And it was in that moment that they needed Yah deeply enough to need a healer. And I want you to know that that same is true for you. Some dimensions of who God is can only be introduced to you at the bitter water. Not because he is unkind or he's punishing you, but it's because he is a healer. And you cannot know a healer until you have a wound. What is that wound? In this story, it was the wound of bitterness and disappointment. Oh, what has to die? What has to die so you can move forward? D, dying to cross over. Every session again ends in something that has to die. And for this session, there are two things that I want to go through that I believe has to die. First is that bitterness towards God. I know that sounds bold, but I have talked enough to people in wilderness seasons to know that this is real. You can believe in God. You could say you love God. You could say you serve him and still be holding something against him for the season he led you through. Maybe it was a prayer he didn't answer the way you asked for. Or maybe is there something that he's allowing that you did not understand? Maybe he led you to a bitter place when you were already thirsty. And that bitterness, it has to die. And it's not because God can't handle the bitterness, right? He can handle it. It's not about him handling it. But he handled Israel's grumbling and still healed the water. But bitterness towards God, what I want you to get here is that bitterness towards God is a wall between you and the very healer you need access to. You cannot receive the healing of Yahweh Rapha while you are holding a grievance against Yah. So you have to bring that bitterness, bring that disappointment. You have to bring it to him and tell him what you have been holding. That is not disrespect. I'm not sure what you've been taught, but I'm going to tear down some altars right now, altars that are in the mind that says that you can't talk to God this way, because that is simply honest prayer. And think about it. Your healing begins at the place where you can be honest with him and you can acknowledge that bitterness that you are feeling. So that's the first thing that has to die. The second thing that has to die is the expectation that healing looks the way you imagined it. Yeah, we get in our minds, we get into these seasons and we start praying to God. And yep, we're supposed to pray during these seasons, but in our mind, we have a way that we think we should be delivered from this particular season. We have a way that we feel we should be healed. In our mind, we have already formulated how this needs to be done. But then God does what he does, and he uses something completely different. Israel didn't ask for the tree in the water. They probably wouldn't even chosen that method because I'm sure no one would have thought to throw a tree in water, a piece of wood in water. But that is exactly what God used. So you have to let go of the prescription you wrote for your own healing. You have to let go of the timelines that you set, the specific person or the outcome or the circumstances you decided that would fix what is broken. No, the God who heals will choose the method. Your job is to bring your Marah, your bitterness. Your job is to bring it to him and trust the tree that he chooses to pick up. Let's look at that declaration as at the bottom. I release the bitterness I have been carrying. I bring my Mara to Jehovah Rapha. He led me here, and he will heal what I could not fix myself. The bitter place is not my ending. It is my introduction to my healer. I pray, Father, that you bless each person under the sound of my voice, whether they listen to it today, 3 days from now, or 3 years from now. Father, I pray that in this moment, you're bringing about the healing that will fix whatever situation that they're in. And I pray, Father, that those that are feeling any level of bitterness, or that's holding on to any expectation as to how they feel relief needs to come. I pray, Father, that they sit in a place of rest, that they're resting in you as their healer. And they're trusting that you're going to use whatever method you deem necessary for the situation that they're in. And Father, I pray that they stand still and see the salvation that only you can bring. So that was session 4 of Born in the Wilderness. Your Mara is not your ending. Think of it as your introduction to a healer you could not have met anywhere else. Yahweh Rapha, he knows what you are carrying. He led you to the bitter water, and he already knows which tree he is going to throw into it. You only have to bring it to him. Come back next Wednesday when a new lesson will drop. Until then, remember, he is your healer, he is your protector, and he is your guide. Shalom.